Hello everyone, welcome back to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 8, Later African Kingdoms. So as the name implies, today we're going to be looking at Africa. And here it is. So far we've discussed Africa only in the terms of the Portuguese. You'll remember in 1415 how they captured Ceuta, right there at the very tip. And then how they sailed around the Sahara Desert to get to the gold and ivory coast down here. And we'll remember Vasco da Gama getting around the Cape of Good Hope, hitting some of these cities here on his way further to India in the east from 1497 to 1499. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look a little bit more in depth at the peoples with whom the Portuguese came in contact. And we're going to start off in Western Africa, so over here, and we're especially going to look at a region on the far west of Africa. Here we go, right here. A region that is named after two of the rivers, the two rivers that it lays between. So this is called the Senegambia. And we see the Senegal River here and the Gambia River there. So we're talking about this little region right in here along the far west coast of Africa. Now, this area never really was a single unified kingdom. There were attempts to have kingdoms in this area, but they didn't really last that long. Instead, what we see are mainly stateless societies that were broken off into tribes that had strong social classes that really defined them. So they were not really big states or anything like that. In this region, there were three main language groups and slightly different cultures too. But we're really mainly talking about the language groups, what they spoke being different. And these were the people who spoke Serer, Pular, and Wolof. Now, talking about those strong social classes, in this area there was a strong hierarchy. You had royalty, nobles, warriors, free farmers. Now all of these people were freeborn, and you had to be freeborn in order to own any land. Obviously, the members of the royalty and the members of the nobility were the ones who owned the best land, but even the poor free farmers could at least own land. And here we see on our map Wolofs, Pulars, Serer, just to give us an idea of, those language groups in the region. Now, below the freeborn were people who were stuck in castes, and they belonged to these castes based on the professions that they had. You would have people who belonged to castes of weavers, jewelers, smiths. Way down at the very bottom you'd have leather workers, because they had to, they worked with animal carcasses, so they were seen as kind of unclean. So those people were in a pretty low caste. But, so the people in these castes could not marry any freeborn person, even like a poor free farmer could not marry anyone from a caste. And there was even a caste below leather workers that couldn't marry other members of other castes even. And that was the caste of the griot. And we're going to talk about griots in just a second. But just remember that castes were based on profession, and they weren't allowed to marry free people. Even below the castes, then, were slaves. And slaves could be obtained by, by war. So if you conquered people, you could enslave them. There were also people just being kidnapped and enslaved. Oftentimes these people were sold at markets, so you could buy slaves at markets. There were even some desperate parents who were so poor that they would sell some of their children into slavery. Slavery was also a punishment for certain crimes that were committed in the territories. And of course, if you were born a slave, you were a slave, right? I mean, if your parents were slaves and you were born, you were then still a slave. Now, the basics of these weird stateless, not weird, but stateless societies was that the nobility would choose a king from the royalty. Then in turn, the king would choose chiefs to rule over the villages for him. So the nobility chooses the king then chooses the chiefs of these villages, and these chiefs, for being in their position, would then give the king a share of the goods generated from the village. So a share of the crops that were grown there, any taxes that were imposed on trade items, imported and exported goods. Also items that were taken in war. So, if there was some spoils or some booty from war, the chiefs would give the king a cut. And this is not really that different from the feudal society in some aspects, right? I mean, you have to repay the king for the power that you have. Now, a major interesting feature of the Senegambia was what we call the age grade system. And this is where groups of males and females in their teens, so let's say I think it was usually around 14 to 19 years old, they would all be initiated into adulthood at the same time. So every male and female from the ages of 14 to 19, let's say, all at once would become adults in society. And the idea of this was that you could create strong group ties among those who became adults at the same time. And this strong bond hopefully would help weaken the bonds of family, thus making people more loyal to the groups of adults that they were now together with, that they became adults with, and then thus the community. So the idea of this age grade system of initiating these groups into adulthood at the same time, the main goal was to make them more loyal to the community than to their family. Now, I mentioned the griot caste just a few minutes ago, and the griot were all throughout West Africa, not just Senegambia. But in the Senegambia, they made basically the lowest caste, right? Griot is the French term for it. It's thought to have come from the Portuguese word criado, which means servant. This caste was so low that there were cases of these people being buried in trees instead of the ground because they weren't deemed good enough to be buried in the ground like the rest of the people. We also mentioned that they couldn't marry outside of their caste. So let's say among the castes, like a leather worker, if he got lucky, could marry into a smith, family and stuff like that. As long as it was within the castes, there was intermarriage between the castes, at least. Except for the griots. So they couldn't marry outside of their caste, which made their position hereditary. And part of this is because, this may seem kind of contradictory, they played a very, very important role in society. They were very closely tied in many ways to the nobles and to the royalty. That's because the griot were keepers of the tribe's culture, basically. These men and women, because it could both be men and women, were storytellers, historians, poets, musicians. You know, whenever there was a celebration, these people would come and sing songs about the history. About the history of the people, of the town, whatever was the case. They had songs about birth, about death, about marriage, about war. So they had all different types of songs that contained the history and the culture of the village, or you know, the kingdom. And in fact, it's been suggested that this idea of the griot, this storytelling in the songs, would have would be a pretty big influence on American music, especially the blues and jazz. It's quite a bit different, but we can see here we have our griot. He's got a stringed instrument there. Many people have tied the banjo to the West African stringed instruments. But yeah, blues and jazz seem to have some influence coming from this idea of this oral tradition, this oral singing. And like I said, these people were so important that most villages would have at least one griot, if not more. And then, you know, these villages having at least one griot, of course, they usually also had at least one groot, right? It's not even pronounced the same. It's not even that good of a pun. Come on, Greg. You can do better than that. But I just really wanted to put in Baby Groot because look how adorable he is. Gonna blow up the world. Moving on from the Senegambia, which here on our map we can see, there's the Gambia River. Basically the Senegal River is like right here. So this would have been the Senegambia region that we just looked at. Next we're going to talk about Songhai. Now, Sunni Ali was the first king of Songhai. He took control of Gao, which was in the Mali Empire. And here we see Gao here. So he took control of that from the Mali Empire. And over time, he and his followers began to take more and more territory from Mali, including Timbuktu, even down to Djenné. And basically, throughout his lifetime, he absorbed what was the former empire of Mali into his own empire, the Songhai Empire. Now, once he controlled Timbuktu, Timbuktu was this really big cultural center in the Islamic world. It was one of the Islamic world's major centers for learning and religious studies. But once he took control of it, Sunni Ali kind of repressed the scholars there. What didn't allow them the freedom that they were used to. Oral history tells us that Sunni Ali drowned in the Niger River, which is the main river that the Songhai Empire was located on. So there's the Niger River, and supposedly Sunni Ali drowned in it. When he died, the empire passed on to his son, who pretty shortly after was overthrown. You can see here's Sunni Ali's years of his rule, and here is the next king who overthrew his son. So his son was overthrown by a general pretty shortly after, a general named Muhammad Touré. Now, Muhammad Touré would also be known as Askia Muhammad or Askia the Great, and it was under Muhammad Touré or Askia that the empire reached its furthest extent. So this map here is basically during the time of Muhammad Touré. You can see how expansive that is, actually, when you think about how large Africa is. And of course, Muhammad Touré aka Askia the Great, was so famous that he is in the Civilization games. I don't know if any of you play them. They're great, but there is the way Civilization, I think this is from 5, depicts Askia the Great. Now, obviously, you don't get the title The Great without doing a lot of stuff, right? I mean, you're not going to be remembered as the Great if you aren't doing, have a lot of accomplishments under your hat. So, as we said, Songhai reached its furthest extent. It was the largest it ever would be under him. He also rebuilt the army. He's a general, so he knows how the military should be working, and he reorganizes and rebuilds the army. He also standardized weights and measures, and in effect, hoping to reorganize the tax system with these standard weights and measures. And this led to a stronger economy. And due to this stronger economy, the extent of trade routes that were linked to Songhai pushed further into Europe and Asia, beyond where they had been going previously. So, as a direct result of his economic reforms, we see a growing economy and extended trade routes then because of it. Now, he was king, but he had this bureaucratic system to help him govern, right? So he had officials underneath him who helped run the state. In his government, he replaced the local officials who made up the bureaucracy with ones that he brought in from the Middle East, with Arab officials. So he brought in Arab officials to help run his government. And he also brought in scholars from the Middle East at the same time. So, with these Arab officials coming in and with these scholars coming in, Songhai, and especially Timbuktu again, became really strong cultural and economic and religious and educational centers in a new golden age for the Islamic world. So, his contributions were pretty great, and thus Askia the Great. Unfortunately for Askia, he became king by overthrowing the previous king. He would in fact be overthrown by his own son, and the dynasty that he found, there were 9 kings in it, including himself. So, Muhammad Ture, then his son, then so on and so forth. There were 9 kings of Songhai who were part of his dynasty. Only 3 died of natural causes. Usually what would happen was they would be overthrown by someone in their own family. So, a little bit of a violent dynasty ruling over Songhai. One that wasn't really prepared to wait for the next king to step down. Muhammad Ture actually lived another 10 years before he finally did die, but he was overthrown as king by his own son in 1528. Just east of Songhai, we see an area that we call Hausa land. And you can see here it is the Hausa Bakwai states in this map, but Hausa land we'll call it. And even some of these at times could be under the influence of Songhai. Now, Hausa land was never an empire or kingdom, just like we saw with the Senegambia, right? Instead, what we see that is different than Senegambia was this was an area full of city-states. City-states like Kano and Katsina. And these city-states were known for their farming and their trading. Some of the goods that they were especially known to trade were the leather of the area. They had gold, also obviously slaves, cola nuts, so, that delicious Coca-Cola that we all love, or Pepsi Cola, whatever, whichever cola you like. I mean, you could be an RC person. But cola nuts, that's the flavoring behind cola. They were traded here, and salt. So those were the main goods coming out of these city-states in Hausaland. Now Katsina, would become such an economic power, very similar to Timbuktu in the sense where Timbuktu was a very strong economic power at first. So like Timbuktu, it was an economic power that then became a very important religious and educational center in the Islamic world too. So Katsina was not quite as high as Timbuktu, but a very, very important center in the Islamic world. And here we see the Gobarau minaret in Katsina. Just south of Songhai and Hausaland was Benin. So here we see there's Timbuktu along the Niger River, right? There's the Niger River, there's Timbuktu. So Songhai would have been all throughout here. Hausaland would have been right around here. And then we get Benin right there. In the 15th century, Benin expanded from what was a city-state along, the lower part of the Niger River into an empire. Now, it certainly wasn't as big of an empire as Songhai, but it's a decent-sized little empire here. We can see Benin City expanding out this way here. So, I mean, with how big Africa is, that's still a pretty good size. Nice little coastal state. The city, Benin City itself, grew to be one of the largest in Africa at the time. Very, very large city for the day and age. Now, we're talking about Benin. This is not modern Benin. Modern Benin is located right around here. This, more ancient Benin, the old kingdom of Benin, which the modern one was named after, is actually in modern-day Nigeria. The Empire of Benin was ruled by an Oba, which was their word for king, and this Oba ruled over what was a decently structured, organized state based on hierarchies. Benin was especially known for its art. Two main media that it was known for. They were known for their bronzes. Bronzes created using what is called the lost wax technique, which is a very intricate and difficult technique to do, one that I don't even fully understand and couldn't explain to you. But the pieces from Benin are considered some of the best examples of the lost wax technique in the whole world. And here you can see an example of the bronze. A little bit of a misnomer here because these were actually made from several different metals. You could have pieces of iron made into what we now class as the bronzes of Benin. And oftentimes their bronze was more of a brass than a bronze itself. So a little bit of a misnomer there, but just we just know that when we say the Benin bronzes, we're talking about all kinds of metalwork. And again, you can see the intricate details in this lost wax technique in casting these bronze. And here's a wall of them in the British Museum. Very, very neat to see. Pretty amazing. And overall, the British Museum has 700 pieces of Benin metalwork in it. And it's not just the British Museum that has hundreds of these pieces. There are other museums throughout the world that have hundreds of Benin pieces themselves, including the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, which has 163 of them. So if you ever get a chance, you get down to the Met, you can see some of these amazing pieces that Benin created. Besides their bronze, they were also known for their skill in carving ivory. This here is called the Festak mask, or as it had been called previously, Queen Idia. And you can see just the amazing amount of detail on this, on ivory, carved into ivory. The inlaid eyes that would have been there. You can see these little elephants up top and down below. It's quite amazing what they could do. Around 1485 was when the Portuguese first arrived to Benin. Remember, they kept pushing further and further. And here we could see some of it being reflected in their art, right? Here's one of their famous bronzes, and it's a Portuguese soldier. He's got the little hat on, the little metal helmet. He's got a gun, and you can see the metal armor, too. And this is just one of many examples of a Benin bronze depicting a European. Lots and lots of examples of them. The arrival of the Europeans, the Portuguese, and then other Europeans would begin to disrupt life in the Empire of Benin, and we begin to see a decline in Benin around 1700 or so. And by 1897, the state was completely conquered by the British. And that's how they got all of those amazing bronze works. They took them and put them in their own museum. Now, neighboring Hausaland, just to the east of it, there's Hausaland, right? We see Kano, we see Katsina here, was Kanem Bornu. There we see the two different groups. They would link up and become Kanem Bornu, a united kingdom. They called their king Mai, so just as the kingdom of Benin had the Oba, Kanem Bornu had their Mai. And the empire would reach its zenith, its largest extent, under Mai Idris Aluma. So King Idris Aluma, and you can see the dates there, 1564 to 1596 was when he ruled. And obviously, Mai Idris Aluma should be played by Idris Elba, right? Not just because they share a name, but seriously, is there anything that this guy makes that he's not great in? The Wire, Luther, Pacific Rim, Star Trek, Zootopia. This guy is amazing in everything. So, if there ever is a movie about Idris Elba, I'm 100% behind Idris Elba starring in that role. Amazing actor. Idris Elba enacted many different types of reforms. For his military, he began to build walled camps around his territory, like little forts almost. He also used the tactic of when his soldiers were marching through enemy territory, they would just burn everything as they went along. And this is called scorched earth tactics. He brought in Berbers. Remember, Berbers were the people who, could travel throughout the Sahara. He brought those people in as to create a camel cavalry force. So they would be fighting on camels for Kanem Bornu. And he also brought about musketeers, so people using guns, and they would be trained by the Ottoman Turks. So he brought in the Ottoman Turks to help train his new force using gunpowder, the newly introduced gunpowder. Diplomatically, we see relations with the Ottoman Empire, which is this massive blue thing here. Really big empire, located here in modern-day Turkey, but also with Egypt, which was inside the Ottoman Empire at the time. So they have very close relations with the Ottoman Empire and its territory in Egypt. And in fact, Idris Aluma may have been the first ruler of Kanem Bornu to ever sign a written treaty or ceasefire. In terms of religion, Idris Aluma was a devout Muslim. He went to Mecca, so he made the pilgrimage, as all good Muslims should, at least once in their lifetime. And then in his country, he built many different mosques and hostels that, where his own people, as well as pilgrims passing through his country, could stay and worship at. So, right, they would stay at a hostel and then worship at the mosque. In terms of politics, he reorganized and reformed the laws based on Islam. So, yeah, he was influenced by Sharia law and really set up a whole new legal system in Kanem Bornu. He also created different marriage alliances within his own court to help strengthen his position and the position of his state. And one thing that shouldn't go overlooked is his use of political hostages. What he would do is he would have important people, they were forced to stay in his court. And while there, they would be not only advising him, so he has, some of the best and brightest minds in Kanem Bornu as his advisors, but they can't really leave. And then the regions where they were from, thus, would hopefully be loyal to him because such important people are there around him, right? You don't do what he likes, that person might not, they might be killed or something like that. So, pretty clever way to keep talented people around him and try to force loyalty as well. In terms of trade, this is along this stretch of the Trans-Saharan. I mean, the Sahara Desert is massive, but along his stretch, the one that was controlled by Kanem Bornu, he began to control all the different oases along their route. And he would collect taxes from them, from these oases, from travelers passing through and whatnot. He also standardized measurements. That's a pretty, normal tactic that we've seen, not only in Africa, but in Europe as well. You want a stronger economy, you want a better economy, you should standardize your measurements. And he made sure that the roads were safe. He, had a pretty strong force that would make sure that the roads were safe. The bandits weren't attacking travelers. So those were some of the big, states or regions in Western Africa. And kind of, this is a generalization throughout Western Africa. Maybe a little bit of an overgeneralization, but, one that we should still make. Throughout Western Africa, wives and children were highly prized. And there were some practical reasons for this. Obviously, they could help you clear and cultivate the land, right? You have just more people to help you. And then, with your children, they were someone who, as you grew older, once you hit, your old age, they would be there to help support you. So some pretty practical reasons, but they also brought prestige and honor to a man. So the more children that you had, was really a mark of prestige in these societies. And so it became a goal for men to have just many children, right? You want to produce a lot of children. In fact, there was a saying throughout Western Africa, without children, you are naked. So that's kind of the idea. Now, in order to get children, men would obtain a number of wives. Not everyone would do this, but a lot of people had multiple wives, so they practiced polygamy there. So a man would have many different wives throughout his lifetime. He could keep marrying younger women too. And the fact that men could keep doing this would create tensions between different generations of males. As these older men keep marrying, younger women, we see the younger men who are looking for wives themselves, begin to push back against them. So there were some tensions there, and sometimes this could lead to some of those men being enslaved, right? Sold off into slavery. So one of the negative aspects of that desire to have children. Now, recall when we talked about Europe earlier, we saw, a lot of growth in population, and then especially growth in towns and cities. So in Europe, land was difficult to come by. In Western Africa, that was not the case. Land was very abundant, and oftentimes large areas would be sparsely populated. The arrival of Europeans had some rather unsettling aspects to it. We talk about a lot of these states in decline after Europeans showed up. They introduced, guns, which just unsettled lots of things, and they had introduced some diseases. And Europeans also came looking with a greater demand for slaves. And we'll get into this later in the semester. The slaves and kind of the havoc that this wreaked. So we'll look into that a little bit later. But the Europeans also brought some beneficial things as well, especially in the form of new crops, like maize, or as we call it, corn, and sweet potatoes. These were both introduced to Western Africa, so some hardy grains and roots that added to the food supply in Western Africa. As far as manufacturing that there was in Western Africa, they had some small industries, but this was nothing on like an industrialized level at all, not even close to that. People would produce some metalwork. Benin obviously had their artwork, but the other peoples had some minor metalwork. They could produce cloth for themselves, spices, and one of the more lucrative goods was salt. And here you can see a modern-day salt mine in Western Africa that is pretty similar to the techniques that they were using back when the Portuguese first came too. So, there's some manufacturing, but not much, and definitely not in the sense that we get when we talk about manufacturing today. So now we've talked about West Africa. Let's move on to the east side of Africa. Just along where the Red Sea meets the Arabian Sea, right around here, we have Ethiopia. It had evolved from the ancient kingdom of Aksum, and eventually kind of became called Ethiopia. Sometimes you'll hear it called Abyssinia. We'll call it Ethiopia here. So evolved from the ancient kingdom of Aksum, and while the countries that we saw in the West were Muslim countries, and some groups that still had traditional African religions too, what we see in Ethiopia is that it was a Coptic Christian nation. Its form of Christianity dated back to really the beginnings of Christianity in the 1st century CE. So it's one of those original Christian communities that was around with the original followers, the spread from the original followers, and while in Europe, we would see what that develop into the Catholic, and eventually, when the Catholic and Orthodox Church split. But that kind of idea, the Catholic and Orthodox, developed in Europe. Coptic religions, Coptic forms of Christianity developed in Africa. So like Egypt had their own form of Coptic Christianity. Ethiopia did. There were some in the Middle East, even some as far as the borders of India. So a very, very ancient form of Christianity here, with slightly different beliefs in the nature of Jesus than what would develop in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, and obviously the Protestant ones that came off of Catholicism. Christianity had been the state religion of Aksum around 330 CE, and in fact the first bishop in Ethiopia was someone from the Roman Empire, a man named Frumentius, who was appointed by the Archbishop of Alexandria, which had the blessing of the Pope in Rome. So this is still early on, before the Catholic Church became the big Catholic Church that it would later become. So they were still kind of tied even by 330, but over time it became more isolated, and the differences between it and different forms of Christianity began to coalesce as it was isolated. During its time, Aksum, and what would then later be Ethiopia, had withstood many different Islamic invasions, from the time of the followers of Muhammad themselves to different waves of Islamic invasions, Islamic conversions. And we saw in Western Africa, they would be converted. Below Ethiopia, in other parts of southern Africa and along the southeast coast of Africa would become Muslim as well. Ethiopia withstood these invasions, withstood these conversions, and remained Christian throughout that. And in fact, in 1441, the emperor of Ethiopia, so they were already Ethiopia by 1441, he heard that there was going to be a council in Florence. It's called the Council of Florence. This was before the Protestant Reformation, right? 1441. So before the Protestant Reformation, the goal of this council was to reunify the Catholic Church with the Orthodox Church. So the Western European form of Christianity and the Eastern form of Christianity in Europe, they wanted to combine them all again in 1441 again. And the Emperor of Ethiopia actually sent some monks from his church to aid in the discussion. The conference, of course, failed, and Catholicism and Orthodoxy remained split. But the fact that these monks came from this African Christian church that was kind of forgotten about by this time. I mean, we're talking about 1,100 years since Frumentius had been sent there as a bishop. Many people didn't know about about Ethiopia being a Christian state. And when the Portuguese were off exploring, one of their goals, we mentioned in converting people, one of their goals was to find this Christian country in Africa. So, and then convert it too. Before we move on, I just had to show this amazing temple. This is Beata Emmanuel. So the Church of Beata Emmanuel. It was built in the 12th century, still the Kingdom of Aksum at that time, but carved out of solid rock. And it is, in fact, one of 11 churches in the town of Lalibela in Ethiopia that is carved from rock. So they have 11 churches there carved straight out of the rock. Just amazing. So after the Portuguese arrived, right, they arrived with Vasco da Gama, and they find this Christian African state. The Portuguese helped the Ethiopians withstand another Islamic invasion. There was a war from 1529 to 1543, and the Portuguese came in towards the end of that war, gave them some weapons, offered a few men to help them, and Ethiopia was able to stand against this. Here we can see a depiction. It's unknown who painted this, but it was found in a French book. So it's a European depiction of what happened in this war. And after the Portuguese helped Ethiopia, stem off this Islamic invasion, they really were hoping then that Ethiopia would convert to Catholicism. They were Christian, they just weren't the right type of Christian according to the Portuguese. So it had been their goal from the very beginning to convert them to Catholicism. Now, since they helped them out, they really hoped that this would make it easier for the Ethiopians to convert to Catholicism. And to help then convince the Ethiopians to convert, they sent members of this newly created order of the Catholic Church, an order called the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits got there, and they began to clash with the locals while trying to convert them. The Jesuits were pretty strong. I mean, one of the major goals of the organization itself was to convert people. So they were very, very insistent. And there were clashes between the locals and the Jesuits. But they did have some success. In fact, the emperor of Ethiopia, the Emperor Susianus I, actually did convert to Catholicism. But when he did, this caused massive civic unrest. The people did not like that he became Catholic. They liked their form of Christianity, and so there were riots, there were, a lot of unrest. And when the son of this emperor became emperor himself, so, the Susianus dies, and his son takes over, he declared that the Ethiopian Coptic Church was the official state church of Ethiopia, and in 1633, the next year, he expelled all the Jesuits from Ethiopia, and the Ethiopian Christian Church again became very isolated. So, just finished with Ethiopia, which is located right around here. Just to the south of them along the coast, from Mogadishu down to Sofala about, is an area that we call the Swahili city-states. We can see it's on the coast, and in fact Swahili means people of the coast, and these were independent city-states. So these were much like Hausaland, right? Their culture was a mixture of local African traditions and Arab elements as well, that came about from Arab merchants moving in and settling in to the local communities, as they were looking for goods. So we see, this mixture between local and Arab elements in the Swahili culture. And they were major players in the trade across the Indian Ocean, which we kind of discussed before we discussed the Portuguese. From their city-states, they exported salt, ebony, sandalwood, gold, ivory, those goods that we talked about during the exploration lecture. The Swahili city-states were also one of the major suppliers of slaves to the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East. So remember, the Ottoman Empire is up in Egypt and then in Turkey, which is right around here, but they also controlled much of the Middle East. And they got many of their slaves from the Swahili city-states, as did other regions around the Indian Ocean. So a major supplier of slaves to the east of Africa. And the west coast of Africa would be major suppliers for the Europeans and for the New World. So different markets for the slaves between them. The city-states thrived until 1498 when Vasco da Gama arrived, right? He came, stopped off in these, and then moved on to India. He didn't do much to them because he had more important goals of getting to India and then, returning home. But throughout the 1500s, the Portuguese began to exercise more and more power in this area. And in fact, by 1505, they really began to exert their control. 1505, they allied with Sofala, and they built a fortress there. They attacked Kilwa and built a fortress there. You can see they started taking tribute, so forced cities to pay them. They would ally with certain ones like Sofala, Malindi, raid others. Then that shows you the independent nature of the city-states, right? Each one was independent, so they could make different treaties or be attacked by the Portuguese, depending on, on how they wanted to interact with the Portuguese. So, yeah, we see 1505, there was Fort Santiago built there, and in fact, there is the remains of Fort Santiago in Kilwa. And as the Portuguese influence and power in this area grew stronger, the city-states themselves began to decline more and more. And the nature of trade in this area, and really throughout all of Africa, began to change. This is going to be true basically of everywhere that the Europeans went. The nature of trade changed. And we're going to get to this later in the semester. At some point, there's a shift between what we could call colonization and imperialism. So later in the semester, we'll look at imperialism, but just know that the nature of trade will change throughout all these areas, including the Swahili city-states. And the area of the Swahili city-states themselves eventually would fall under the control of the Dutch, the people from the Netherlands, as well as the British, right? The people in England and Great Britain. And we'll see that later this semester as well. Here are some early European depictions of some of the city-states. The top one is Aden, which is actually not a Swahili city-state. I believe it's off the Arabian Peninsula, if I remember correctly. But these bottom three, here we see Mombasa, one of the big Swahili city-states. There's Kilwa here, and then this is Sofala. Yeah, so European depictions of some of these Swahili city-states. So that concludes this lecture, the later kingdoms of Africa, which again, we saw a lot of city-states, so it wasn't just kingdoms. For our next lecture, we're going to look at something that is closely tied to the European activity in Africa, and was mentioned many times in this lecture, in fact, slavery. So until then, this is Greg, signing off.